This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
This is Pete Kirsten from F5.
Today, we're going to talk about adaptive applications in a complex world. Hit the music, Claude.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Most of the listeners, most of my govies out there know about F5, and they have a pretty good idea what their history is. Maybe they've heard of them, they've seen the trade shows, maybe they use their product. What I want to do is every now and then to bring F5 in the studio, give them kind of an uplight update for 2023, and I think what I want to do is position themselves as how they can help federal agencies with a lot of the new goals they have. They have a hybrid cloud, they have to worry about zero trust, they have to worry about security, and I think F5 has got a strong reputation in the community, but maybe my listeners aren't familiar with what's current going on with the company. And that's why I brought in Peter. Peter Kirsten is our guest today. He's the Regional Vice President with F5. Peter, how are you?
Good, thank you, John.
Okay, so let's say you're sitting in the metro or you're at an event downtown and someone sees your name badge and they say F5. Well, I know all about F5. You guys do load balancing, right? And you go, no, wait a minute. So how do you disabuse them of that notion, or how do you amplify that? So people got this in their mind. Talk about F5 and load balancing and really what you can help our agencies do.
So generally, if I'm in a situation like that, I'll let them know that that's absolutely where we got our start, right? But we've been around for 25 years. And like I say, it's typically, I'll open up a meeting and ask, what do you know about us? And they'll say load balancing.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, a lot's changed in 25 years. Right. So we've moved from, initially it started with load balance. It moved where we created a space called application delivery, which was more than just load balancing, but making sure that the applications were available with the right performance, resiliency. And then we moved into security and making sure that we were protecting them. But in the last 5 or 6 years, we moved to embrace the move where the government is moving to containerized applications and cloud deployments, providing services to scale and secure modern applications and APIs. So we've been calling this adaptive applications, and we're working to use layer 7 telemetry along with artificial intelligence and machine learning to simplify and enhance application deployments and maintenance, right? So today, where are we? We're preferred partner of about 18,000 customers globally. Wow. And 85% of the Fortune 500. And we power about half the world's apps. So here's an interesting fact, John, and what I'd share with someone on the metro, right? What you may not know about us is the role we play in cybersecurity. We've established what I think is a leading position in protecting the digital world and the U.S. government because we're one of the few players 100% focused on application security at a time when those threats are growing rapidly, right? We just passed $1 billion in annual security revenue, right? So that makes us one of the largest players. And we're the only company that can deliver, secure, and optimize any app, any API, anywhere, right? Through this diverse portfolio and distinctive capabilities from hardware to software to SaaS and managed services. So it's been a long time since we've been just a load balancer, but it's still a core competency.
So I talk to young people all the time. I'm in the classroom on Thursday night downtown, and if I told them about your company and I used the phrase that you phrased, application, they may raise their hand and go, no, wait a minute. I just listened to a podcast about quantum encryption and encrypting the data. And Peter, you don't get it. It's all about the data. It's all about protecting the data, isn't it? I mean, isn't that a differentiator? Is that, some people focus on the data, some people focus on the APIs of the app. So what F5 in their 25 years of being beat up in the cybersecurity world and learning lessons, I guess the data, the priority for you folks is the API and the apps. Is that right?
That's right. It's all about the apps, right? I often joke that we're like, if you remember your Dr. Seuss, the Lorax for the app, right? We speak for the app. We make the apps work in any environment. So traditionally, I think that apps have been in a singular enclave. And now we're thinking about data, and we're thinking about how data gets spread to different data centers into the cloud, et cetera. You have to protect the data, often the data is sitting behind the apps, and the apps need to be protected a little bit differently than the data. And as we move to a more digitized world where there's more and more dependency on those applications, you've got to make sure that the applications work, or you don't function as an agency or an organization.
I went to your website, f5.com, and I took a bunch of notes this morning pretty early. And load balancing, of course, app security, API management, and then fraud prevention is right in the list there. It's like, well, okay, connect the dots here. How does the LAW Act connect these dots together with fraud prevention?
Well, so fraud prevention is absolutely something we focus on more in the commercial market than Fed, although we do have a couple key customers. And what has been happening in the world of cyber criminals is they've been focusing on how do they find, steal money. And they can do that by compromising identity. And often the tool sets that they're using are leveraging bots and machine learning and the ability to automate attacks around bots to take maybe compromised credentials that they're finding on the dark web, spraying them out there. So we have an entire solution set that's focused on fraud, but it intersects into what we do with our other security kind of protections. And we leverage kind of the information, the data around how we look at authentication. So that's how I tie the two together.
Right. It's the choke point, or it's the bottleneck that can examine it and see what's going on. So actually, it's not out of sequence at all. Load balancing, app security, API management, fraud prevention fits right in, because that's the net result of effectively accomplishing those three tasks, isn't it?
It is. The other way to look at it is, like, our primary use case for government typically is authentication. Mm-hmm. And when you look at fraud prevention, it's about looking at the authentication tool chain and how do we authenticate users that don't have a CAC or some type of a higher level of identity and multi-factor authentication.
Right. Makes sense. And maybe we can talk about this in a different, a little bit off topic here, but the key pillar to zero trust is identity, authentication. I mean, this is the first pillar. And so I think this is, F5 is positioning itself right in I'm thinking of architecture here in buildings and everything else. And I'm thinking about enterprise architecture. So maybe the phrase is API architecture, or API design or something. Maybe that's what it's all about, is it?
Well, if you talk about APIs, I think the first thing that I would say is that API security is critical. And it's new, and a lot of people don't think about it, right? And API security gets kind of merged in with other things. We think that it's critical and that everyone should have API security on all of their APIs. But if you back up a second, let's say you were talking to the college students, maybe start with kind of what an API is, right? Because it's an application programming interface that enables applications, or with modern application, different parts of a single application to communicate with each other, right? Yep. So it's kind of an intermediate layer that processes data between and transfers between systems and allows that application data and the functionality to be available to third parties or other departments within an organization, right? So most of your new modern web applications rely on APIs to function. So they're kit and parcel to the same thing. You have apps and you have APIs. And when you add them, you also introduce risk into the application by allowing outside parties to access it. Mm-hmm. So even though the backbone of modern apps are APIs, APIs suffer from some of the same exploits as the apps that they service. And those type of exploits are different, right? They're a little bit nuanced, right? They're vulnerability exploits, authentication-based attacks, unintended access, right? And users getting data they shouldn't have, data exposure, DOS attacks, right? And it's one of the fastest growing attack vectors that we've seen in the last 2 years, right? So we have a whole suite of solutions that protect APIs, right? Big IP does, NGINX, F5 Cloud Services. They all have API security. And it enables us to kind of apply that, because as you look at the APIs and where those APIs are operating, you need the right system that was constructed for the environment, right? a modern application that sits inside of containers is going to have an entirely different kind of nature based upon how containers work and the size of the software that works in the microservices. It's different. If you need a fully managed service, it's going to be different, right? So we kind of pull those all together. And when we talk about APIs, we're typically also talking about web application firewalls. And we have this concept of one WAF, which ties everything together with kind of a common control plane so that you can deploy a security policy in one area and map it to other areas. And so you have a universal defense that isn't different just because you happen to deploy it in AWS or just because you deployed it on-prem versus a SaaS service that you purchased.
Well, Peter, let's take a look at this suite and pull out a couple topics here. So let's go from the classroom into a conference in downtown D.C., sitting around with a bunch of cybersecurity people. I'm sure if you tossed out a term like big IP, they would kind of have a fuzzy idea of it, or maybe what you mentioned earlier is NGINX. So maybe for our audience, maybe you can differentiate those two for the people who don't really know as much about FI as they normally should.
Sure. So like high level, just to answer the question quick, and we'll get in a little bit of nuances. Big IP is typically what we deploy for traditional applications that traditionally sit inside the data center behind kind of one environment. And NGINX is what we deploy for modern applications or microservice environments. So if you think about it, traditional apps, relatively large, tough to deploy and maintain, but pretty well understood. And Big IP offers a lot of flexibility so that as the apps need, those are really tough to modify those apps, right? You might get like one time a year. And so Big IP is flexible enough that you can adjust around that application for that application. TLS is moving or something else, we'll take care of that for the app. For Big IP or modern apps, they're built into an entirely different framework, right? Where pieces of the application are broken apart based upon functionality, and they sit in separate areas of what's called a container, and they communicate with each other via those APIs, right? So they're faster to deploy and update, built with the idea that it can be updated as much as several times a day. And so that's where NGINX sits. And then Big IP also plays a role because it can sit above NGINX and Big IP and directing and securing kind of the web traffic to either the modern apps or to traditional apps in a hybrid scenario, which is often what we see with the federal government today. And we don't see that going away because people are going to have their legacy apps. They're going to have modern apps. And the government's kind of been traditionally struggling to get to full modern application, both because of concerns about security, but also you need the right people on board in the right environment. And you want to make sure that those are really well thought out before you deploy a system that the government's going to rely on for that. And those generally are there today, but it's not going to be one size fits all.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the struggle. And when you get a complex environment with all these different firewalls and rules and APIs and apps, it gets difficult to really understand. And I think once a year, what your company, what F5 does, is put together a public sector symposium. And there you can, back to the classroom analogy, it's like a classroom. You go there and you can say, so where should I use Big IP? No. Peter's going to give a talk, and he's going to talk about 3 places where you can use IP, or it may work better with NGINX. And so, tell me more about this symposium. I think it's coming up in the next couple of months, isn't it?
It is. It's March 21 to 23. It'll be at the Ritz-Carlton at Tyson's Corner, and it starts with some keynotes where we traditionally try and address from an F5 perspective, and a government perspective, some of the key trends or upcoming kind of challenges for government. And then we have 4 in-depth user-focused engineering breakout tracks where we're really focused either on NGINX or Big IP, and it might be a 100 or 200 or 300. Those are all designed to lead people to certifications, and they're free for government.
Good.
And then it's full day interactive. We got, partners, and we've got other groups within it. So you can have face-to-face interaction with F5 folks or with partners, and they have the opportunity to take a exam on site for free. if you're a government employee. If they just go to f5.com and they search for the 2023 Public Sector Symposium, that'll lead them to registration. You get registered early. It's a pretty big show. It's a great event.
Tomorrow, I am going to interview a gentleman. We're talking about software development lifecycle and security, talk about software libraries, and talking about this thing called shift left. When I was doing my research on F5, I saw some articles about, Big IP actually helping in that endeavor and being involved in fixing vulnerabilities. And I said, wow, it's got more power than I thought. So I guess that's an area where you're also playing. Is that right?
That's right. Well, and typically shift left is a term that is referencing the move to modern application deployments and being able to deploy applications a lot faster. And so traditionally, when we think shift left, we're thinking, how do we apply the services associated with NGINX into that environment, right? And in that environment, right, NGINX open source as an application tool set is deployed all over the world, all over the government, et cetera. And this is about how do we apply those services into that area. And specifically shifting left just means how do we get things to go faster, right? Whether it's pushing security earlier, it's pushing into a continuous innovation, continuous development type of a pipeline versus a traditional application would be called waterfall environment.
So we actually fit in with that discussion for tomorrow, doesn't it?
100%.
Wow, that's really great. And I'm just trying to put some of these concepts. When I think of zero trust and security, we talked about authentication, and I'm thinking about firewalls. I mean, does a firewall fit in this discussion, or is a firewall just completely different? Am I having a different idea from a firewall than it's normally understood to be?
Sure. Well, if you think about a traditional firewall at layer 4, right, is looking for information from the source and making a decision about whether to allow or not allow something. Where a web application firewall is a little bit different. And a web application firewall is an absolutely essential and incrementally separate kind of part of any organization's cybersecurity arsenal, right? We app, just like we talked about with APIs, every app should be covered by a web application firewall, right? When you think about application layer attacks, for example, if someone is trying to insert code into a form field or break in through some sort of user authentication in the application, a regular firewall doesn't have the visibility into that layer. And therefore, they can't protect against those type of attacks. And that's why there's a need for an additional layer of protection at layer 7, right? So we had, for example, several large agencies that had already deployed their web application firewall. And the flexibility that gives them as an adjunct to a traditional firewall was they were able to block and protect against Log4j virus because of the difference in how those security mechanisms are deployed, right? And that's just an example of having a tool set that's differentiated and flexible that enable them to extend their cybersecurity boundary. When you think about, you mentioned zero trust networks, and zero trust networks are mandated and necessary, and it's a pretty hot topic right now. But what zero trust networks traditionally don't do is they're not focused on the application. And even though you may have it in place, or you may have a plan based upon the presidential directive to put one in place, your application infrastructure is still vulnerable because a ZTNA is going to determine who has access to an application. And usually it's going to be for internal users, but it doesn't know a user's intent. And so in order to kind of have complete security, a web application firewall should be protecting every app and really every API from all traffic, both internal and external. And
so when we talk about remote code execution, and I'm putting it in perspective, I'm doing my own architecture here. So that's what the adaptive application is all about. Because, John, it doesn't, punch a clock at 8 o'clock in the morning, go home at 6. It's there 24 hours a day, and it adapts to the threats, and the threats have to vary during the day. And I imagine all kinds of different types of threats, too. So adaptive applications means they can analyze live apps and this remote code execution could be one of them. They get blocked. So it's almost protecting the it's almost like a river going by and protecting everything going back and forth through that firewall and stopping the back. That in of itself has got to be difficult.
Yeah, adaptive apps is an F5 coined kind of term of how we look at how we are going to interact with the application. So applications are getting more and more complex, right? We talked about deployments into cloud or hybrid models, on-prem, modern app, legacy apps. And so adaptive applications at its core is the concept that as those become more complex, you're still going to have hybrid environments. And you're going to need to be able to look at the layer 7 telemetry that's unique inside the application and make decisions based upon some of that information to speed up and simplify how that decision process is being made. And if you can apply artificial intelligence and machine learning to that, you are kind of closing a loop on some of those decision trees or making those available to someone much quicker before the problem exists. Or if you've identified a problem, how quickly can you resolve that problem, right, from a troubleshooting or a forensic standpoint?
Well, we're kind of running out of time here. If you're listening to this and want to learn more, do a bit deeper dive into the product offerings that F5 have. Public Sector Symposium, March 21st, down at the Ritz-Carlton, Tyson's Corner. And you can go to f5.com and find the registration there. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Peter Kirsten, Regional Vice President, F5.
Thank you very much, John. Appreciate you bringing us on, and hopefully we'll see folks at our symposium.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.